Fire. A man once broke out a war. And now the news. A war once broke out between two factions of one kingdom. But since they were both parts of the same domain, it simply meant that the kingdom was at war with itself, a distinction never perceived by the majority of those caught up in the conflict. Those who do succeed in leaving their homeland for a new state do so only by becoming totally self-centered and concerned about no one but themselves. Anything less or other than this will leave you forever in the middle of the fray. Okay, for those of you who want to take the test early, I'll add this. There are two distinct types of self-centeredness. One is the type displayed by some ordinary people, and the other totally dissimilar and unrecognizable. One man said, "I keep looking for help." "I know you do," he replied. "I keep reading, hoping to stumble across some ultimate secret," he said. "I know you do," he replied. "And I, more than anything else, think all of the time about this matter," he said, and this time replied, "Have you ever considered that right there may be your problem, and that upon realizing that what you search for might be revealed?" Upon arriving back home for one of his periodic visits, the first thing the child said to his mother was, "And don't tell me again that scratching it only makes it worse." "I know that, and am either an idiot or else incomprehensibly lazy not to be always acting accordingly. So please don't remind me again. My idiocy and laziness are all too well known to me." And his mother simply stared at him silently until he added, "But you're right. My laziness and stupidity are not all too well known to me, or else I would not still be so dense and lethargic." And Mama replied with a wide-eyed smile, "If the noise of the trains running by your house continue to bother you, the trains will continue to run by your house." And a man wrote to the "What do I do now, doctor?" and asked, "Well, what do I do now?" And the doctor replied, "You know damn well what. It couldn't be clearer, and you know it. You're just asking me in the attempt to waste some more time." And with that, another man was tempted to write to the "Well, that about does it, doctor," but instantly realized the inherent redundancy. Sort of like all them trains going by, huh? After performing his own yearly exam, one man presented himself with this diagnosis: "Forget about cancers. It's the conversations you should be concerned about." And speaking of health matters, do you realize that man is the only creature who has an organ that, when it's involved with its normal activities, by so doing, precludes itself from further development? There are several types of minds in men roaming about this planet. One type accepts life pretty much at face value, while allowing themselves the right to complain and criticize, and a second type that believes they see deeper and find life fraught with strangeness. Then there are a few who find it strange that men cannot take life as it is without perceiving the need for comment of any kind. What these few find actually most incomprehensible is why, once they've acquired this view, it is so difficult to put into constant practice as regards the runnings of their own mind. There was once a land that was constantly troubled by a local dragon, and upon seeking advice from an oracle were told that they could either try and kill the beast, which they would ultimately find impossible to do, or else learn to live with its continual presence without it being of any concern to them, which they would also discover was not possible. Or else they could, and right here, the oracle glanced off into the distance, seeming to think better of what she was about to say, then waved her hand dismissively, cutting off the conversation where it stood. Not by any means to most of the people's satisfaction, but strangely enough, a few in the crowd lit up like Roman candles. One man developed this attitude toward thinking. He'd think all that he seemed able to on a subject, determining this by the fact that he either reached what he could accept as a satisfactory conclusion or else found himself totally weary of the subject, then would try again to look at the matter, but without using any of the thoughts he had had about it previously. Any practical point to be derived from this is far too obvious to have to be pointed out, to be noted for the few, and much too obscure to ever be of any use to everyone else. In his striving for ever-increasing efficiency, one man has made further condensations in his personal dictionary by combining the listings of the words, treating them as synonyms: weak, stupid, lazy, and annoyed. So pondered one chap, how can thinking be both so much fun and, on the other hand, such an irritant? And as he waited for an answer to come to him, he finally realized that part of the answer was the fact that no answer would be forthcoming. The man race is divided into two groups. Actually 34, but for the sake of this, 2. One group, which is always upset to be told that they have missed their train. And another, much smaller band, who are annoyed to find that the trains are still running. Even though words have no power, they can provide pleasure. The question then is, what is your pleasure? How to faultlessly judge your immaturity. You still worry over behavior. And a man wrote the king, what else is there to worry about? And as always, with much pleasure, did his grace receive a fresh example of a good subject's steadfast allegiance. Known to a few outside the liege's grasp as unswavering, senseless submission to the mind's meaningless attachment to external matters of the kingdom. Talk may well be the most frustrating, biggest waste of time there is when it comes to the enlightening state, but so is everything else. There was once a kingdom that was divided into 2 parts. It didn't actually exist in 2 parts, but since the people said that it did, it certainly seemed to. There was once a man who went to see a great mystic, only to discover he was merely a tailor. A seamstress? One man said, okay, oh no. And one man said, okay, let me get this straight. First, we don't know anything. Then we know something. And then we don't know anything again? Men watch their thoughts for about the same reason they watch TV. Because it's on. Be clear on this. The message is never the problem. It's the medium. And finally, cocking his head from side to side, a kid said, "I hear a noise." "Ignore it," said his father. How about another look-see at another continuing, everywhere to be found notion regarding man, and by almost any description his possible further development, all the way from conventional community wisdom to religion to the so-called mystical literature, is the continuing exhortation that man should be free of attachments. It's oftentimes couched in other terms, but that's what it amounts to, that a man should be free of attachments. And as always, the simplistic, the prevailing interpretation of it is that a man should not be attached to physical possessions. If they attempt to move it up a bit on the ladder of intelligence, it takes on a patina of potential metaphorical significance, and it's analyzed to be that a man should not be attached to not only physical possessions, but routine affairs of the world, such as he should not be attached to, first, the simplistic version, the riches as represented, let's say, by gold and stock portfolio, and then a bit higher, he should be not attached not only to that, but to the notion of being rich, that he should not be attached to any picture he has of himself in a social scale or in a social setting, that he should not be attached to the ideas of fame, fortune, recognition, kind of the general denunciation amongst the ordinary of vanity. It gets a bit higher, and a few people here and there throughout history do get as far as taking the whole matter internally where it belongs. Because I'll repeat, for any of you who are really interested in this, it's one of the few statements that any routine idiot, including your humble servant, that's the trouble of going unscripted. Sometimes you find yourself somewhat surprised by what you just heard. I was going to say one of the few things that a man who even understands a little bit can say with absolute certainty, and that is that if there is any chance of a man affecting what he is, changing what he is, then all of the ammunition, all of the nourishment, all of the weapons, all of the information, the whole schmear is in his mind and nowhere else. And I'll go ahead and do it for you as always and say, nowhere else? That's right, sir. Nowhere else. That if you look outside and you think you see things, if you listen with your ears and you think you hear things, you are mistaken. Or else you're simply ordinary. Or put another way, you're going nowhere. There is nothing, there's no help, There is no ammunition. There is nothing to use. There is nothing that even exists in this realm outside the mind. It's enough for ordinary people, philosophers and public metaphysicians, to opine, whine, and sing about that life is simply an illusion, that all of this does not really exist. Which has been an old example of that, is some philosopher, some would-be mystic tried that on a real mystic, and the real mystic hit him with a rock and split open his skull and said, well, what do you say about that? I don't like to repeat such stories such as that, because I know we all see the ravages that useless, gratuitous violence is wrought upon the young people of our day and time. And I, by God, for one, never mind, that was another. I might start writing a script. Anyway, so I won't repeat that story. It is enough that ordinary philosophers, so-called thinkers, and intelligentsia and poets, a very old story, and they believe that, in fact, they have lifted it, or that they have taken it from metaphysical literature, because probably the oldest recognized nowadays historically would be the Vedic literature, and it is replete with the gods and everyone else saying that this whole existence of man is simply an illusion, and you might as well get over it, and you're an idiot to take it seriously. That leads nowhere by now, since you've had 5,000 or 6,000 years. Well, those of you that are a little older than the rest of you here, you've had that long collectively to realize that that tells you nothing. You can go ahead and agree. You can hear someone say, life is an illusion. And you go, ooh. And you think everything, and they says everything, look out, and what you see about life is an illusion. And you can go, ooh, if you want to. But the question is this, of what benefit is it going, ooh, or saying, I believe you? Which is the kind of gratuitously violent question that the ordinary wish not to deal with. It leads nowhere is the point. It's neither here nor there, and it does not matter. It's what the story about the mystic then picked up something and hit a guy and said, well, do you call this chair? Do you call this brick real? Is that an illusion? Is that illusionary blood? Is that your illusionary skull that is now rent? And then the man said, rent-free? And that's another story. That has to do with intelligence on the Upper East Side, where they no longer have rent control. It gets too complicated to go into in this day and time, at least tonight. It's for people who believe that they have some native intelligence, and it finds out that you're simply a squatter. And as I said, it is too abstruse to show you how it's tied into the current, the continuing at least, rent control policies in certain areas of this planet. To say that the world outside of man is an illusion, it doesn't matter whether it's true or false. It doesn't matter what you say. It offers no nourishment whatsoever. It gives you no useful information. What they were pointing at is that your interpretation of it, every man's mental interpretation of it, is an illusion in that it is absolutely faulty. It cannot be made right, and it does not give you, for the purposes of enlightenment or an awakening, a change. What your mind gives you offers no useful information, that it is an illusion. And again, even a would-be mystic for a long time wants to say to himself, at least, everything? Yeah, everything. You mean everything I think about this is an illusion? Yes. But back to the attachments, which is from whence they cometh, is from this idea. The idea of attachments, that you go all the way from the idea, the interpretation that to be free of attachments would be to be free of the encumbrances of greed, the acquisition of physical possessions, which is neither here nor there. If that's your problem, then you got a bigger problem than anybody's ever going to help you with if you are tied up with that and believe that you're still interested in changing your state internally. That's no condemnation, because people who are caught up in that have no interest in this anyway, so it works out. But even if you're not rich and you can't seem to get rich, if it still bothers you as much as it does what's going on in your head, if it's kind of a toss-up, there's an old story for that one too. That's right. You got it. You knew that story. Guy prayed to the enlightenment God. I'll give you anything if I can only discover what's going on in life. And the enlightenment God kept thinking about it, and the guy kept bothering him, singing up all these prayers, and finally the muse of enlightenment said, okay, I'll give you a choice. I'll either let you see what's going on in life, or I will place $14.2 million in a numbered bank account in Switzerland. Which will it be? I said, I'm thinking. If that's your problem, that's a continuing problem. But if that's your problem sufficiently, it's not really seen as your problem. You don't perceive it as a problem. You just perceive it as you are being unfairly overlooked by the muses of fortune in life, that you're not being treated correctly. But if you can go from the attachments, if you can take the translation or see it as going from attachments to physical possessions into what appears to be more of a non-physical area that has to do with human characteristics and traits, ills, sins, emotional or spiritual faux pas, such as move it from the belief that you should not be attached, or that you'd be better off not to be attached to possessions, up a little higher, you might say on an allegorical scale that you take it to be that you should not be attached to the idea of wealth. You should not be attached to the idea of fame and renown. And it's still, though, do you understand? It is still tied to the external world. Fame is the external world. Nobody's famous inside. That's what fame is. If you're famous inside, you're awake. I got news for you. But ordinary people, you don't know whether you're famous, you have to check with people. Hey, do you know who I am? And if they don't, you think, well, you got to work on it some more. If they keep sitting you next to the kitchen and you say, don't you know who I am? They look at you good and say, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, just get out. They even take that table away from you. As long as I'm here on this point, not to berate religion, as you know, because they're doing their own job. They have their own business. But look at all of what's considered to be sins from the religious sense, and even into a secular view of it, what's considered to be untoward characteristics of the human psyche. They are all, religion and psychologists, are just conventional wisdomnists. When they come up with proverbs or 10 commandments or 11 commandments about what a man should be doing, the kind of condemnations of greed, since we're talking about that, they're looked at as being behavioral. They're looked at, although they don't stop to analyze it, not behavioral, they're looked at as being what they call spiritual, internal matters. Of course, religion does call them spiritual. A psychologist, if they were saying, well, a person, that vanity can be detrimental to the human personality, that a little self-pride and self-esteem is all right, blah, blah, blah. But if you get into the area past a certain point in vanity where it begins to stretch its connection to the reality of what you are, then it can perhaps have pathological effects on the human psyche. They're treating it as though all of these descriptions, phobias, sins, uncomely human traits such as greed, they treat them as though they are internal. The religious-minded would treat it, they'd refer to it as some sort of shortcomings of the spirit. Psychologists would call it unprofitable psychological positions, views, and they treat them as though they're internal, which certainly not here to cure or to change what's going on in the external world, but if you don't watch it, even you will fall into looking at it that way, and such matters are not internal. Being greedy cannot manifest itself internally. Being arrogant. Being reticent to the point of near incapacitation. Yeah. Think about what's considered to be just the menu of the shortcomings of the human spirit, the human psychology. And they're taken to be by their by their definition. The ills of the spirit's internally, according to the religious people. Psychological problems are certainly in man's psychology, wherever that is, but it's internal. It's not in a drawer somewhere. He doesn't have it out in the carport. It's in him. They're taken to be internal matters, and they're not internal matters. A man cannot sit off as a recluse up in a tree, away from everyone else, and be arrogant. You cannot sit in a cave alone and be greedy. Now watch what you think, and you think, well, yeah, you can. No, you can't. If you had been greedy, the only reason you say, yeah, you can, is because you're already experienced with it. And so you think, well, I know what greedy is, I know what arrogant is. But if you had never known it, and you grew up alone in a cave, you would have never become arrogant. If you grew up alone, you would never have been greedy. How could you be greedy? What's there to be greedy about? How could you be arrogant? How could you be pushy? How could you be full of self-pity? Of course, I'm really pushing it now. If you grew up alone, how would you even know you had a self? But we don't get into that, do we? I knew you didn't. Back to the attachments. Under all ordinary conditions, that's about as far as men can take the idea of attachments, is up to what would appear to be matters of the spirit/psychology. And yet they do not. Because the mind still takes this to be, erroneously so, they take the ills or shortcomings, the negative aspects that we're mentioning, they would take them to be, insist that they are internal. They're not internal. If we went past the point that ordinary minds ever take the idea that you would be better off not to have attachments, or taken to a further extent that a man cannot understand the truth about existence while having attachments. But that's what it comes down to in the short version. Ordinary minds will never take it past the point that we're discussing, or that refers to characteristics of that person's personality. And to them, that appears to be a zenith in thought. And I understand that. It does, comparably speaking, if comparably speaking amounted to anything, but if comparably speaking, it is an accomplishment to say that a person's interpretation went from the idea that a man would be better off, or that a man must be unattached, have no attachments to achieve any improvement in his condition. Then comparably speaking, relatively speaking, you could say it's some sort of progress to go from the idea that a man should have no possessions whatsoever, which is about as childish, about as simplistic as you can get. But please note, that does not mean that it is not without its adherents. Of course, there are more people who are vocal adherents of that than there are adherent adherents. We've got more people who's in favor of people being without possessions than they are themselves. But hey, they're no idiots. Or they wouldn't be saying things like that publicly. They would be the ventriloquist instead of the dummy, or vice versa for those of you in a different time zone. The attachment, the idea of attachment, when it gets to its highest possible level, if I completely muddied it all up, if it gets to its highest level out in the general area of what you might read, what you might hear any other human, and very few at this, but another mind would say, well, the idea of being without attachment, or freeing oneself from attachments, or the notion that a man cannot have attachments and ever change his state of consciousness, his state of what he is. The highest you will hear, and notice it'd be the highest that you have generally taken it yourself, when you reflect on it, is to get to the point that I was describing as the psychological / spiritual, that the attachments are not simply being caught up into physical possessions, but it's brought up to the idea that a man should not be dictated, that his views of life, his own personality should not be either totally or too much formed, too much bound by his attachments to his own psychological / spiritual characteristics, read shortcomings. Does that take any talent to try and clear up muddied waters you've muddied and make them worse? It is taken to be as high. It is as high as men can normally go, and I would say that, except under extraordinary conditions, that includes all of you, because we're talking about the mind now. We're not talking about an individual's personality or an individual's potential. I'm talking about what is the known and observable limits because of the construction of the human mind as it is. That the highest it gets in this kind of interpretation is that a man should not be attached to his own psychological shortcomings, his own personal shortcomings. And of course, they're not meaning his height and his skin color or his size of his nose. Is internal, psychological, or spiritual shortcomings, his own characteristics which do not seem to quite reach the mark. If you didn't know any better, if you could never see any further than that, that would sound sufficient, and it certainly can keep you supplied with busy work for the rest of your life. But that is not, I submit to you. I'm telling you, that is not what it is. Because on that basis, you will be still dealing with the kind of news items that I have reported here faithfully to you for the last few nights, one of which being, you will never find that which you have pretended you lost, or the attempt to cure an imaginary disease only makes it worse. If you believe that the idea of being unattached has anything to do with any aspect that would fit into a definition or description of your personal characteristics, of your personal eccentricities, anything having to do with what is ordinarily just called some personality trait of yours, some spiritual trait, but personality about covers it in any sense you want it. For you to believe that the idea, or that the reality, if I insisted, if we took for a moment that we're trying to consider, and I insisted that the most important idea that probably has ever been presented to someone attempting to do this, to pursue this, is to realize that as long as they are attached, as long as they have attachments, no change is possible. And so we all say, well, let's take that for a moment and as a real serious working ultimatum. You would still take it. If I said, well, let's all think about it, what's the furthest you can take that? Be as blunt, be as honest with you, be as straightforward with that idea as possible. What can you make of it? And the mind, the most it will make of it is the mind to indulge in what appears to be, it's still a form of condemnation, but it appears to have turned itself in a more insightful sense, that the mind will turn itself, if you're wired up at all to do this, it will turn itself or on you and pick out characteristics of your personality in the widest sense of the word. And say, well, what it means is, obviously, that I should not be attached to mental pictures I have of me. I should not be attached to imaginary notions I have of myself. Or I should not be attached to what might be more in the area of shortcomings to my personality. You can't get anywhere with that. There is only one thing that a man can profitably, that will actually have a practical value, that will actually affect him, that there is only one thing with which he can sever his attachment to such an end. And that's thought. No selective quantitation of it. It has nothing to do with what appears to be your personal thought. And once you see it, it may appear muddy at first glance, but the mind will try and take that idea and translate it into what I just said that is not of value, and that is what it perceives to be your personal quirks or to be aspects of your personality. And they go, oh, you mean, well, yeah, well, all you're saying is having thoughts when I think about me triumphing over people who have mistreated me, or when I think about me being able to walk in a room and people go, wow, you know who that is. Nuh-uh. That's back where it was. As long as the noise of the trains going by your house bother you, you can be assured of this. The trains will continue to run by your house. At least any of you get too slippery that Vaselined up your brain some way. Even if you find the noise at times attractive. Well, I can't leave that there. I covered that after I wrote the other news item. People do not find the noise attractive because when they find it attractive, they don't find it to be noise. So I did cover that. As always, I have protected my own young ass from writing these news items that sound as though they could be open-ended, or that could be faulty snaps on the rear entrance to your union suit. Allegorically speaking, however, of course. I protected myself to no profit whatsoever, but I did. I helped protect you. The other news item that was after that tonight said that although words have no power, they can provide pleasure. The question then is, what is your pleasure? That is, at times people do not find the noise of the trains to be noise. They find the sound, which I'm talking about thought, is they find the thought pleasurable. Because there is, without any doubt, especially people who are wired up to be interested in such as this, you can have this. I shouldn't speak for everybody, but I'm just speaking in general. I was saying, excluding sex and Haagen-Dazs and a good warm soft bed after a hard day's work, maybe those three things. After that, thought can be just about as much fun as you can have. You can add a few others if you want to, but in general, some people can have as much fun with the mind as damn near anything else that other people consider to be avocational pleasantries. And other than me being more specific about people such as us, the world is full of, the world has some number of, I should be more exact, there are a certain number of people in the world at any particular time who can find pleasure in the mind. All the way from rather pedestrian examples of crossword puzzle fanatics, and don't write me, you people. But just such as that, to playing word games, people who enjoy reading scientific or at least some form of non-fictional writing, people who used to be called philosophers, that there are people on the planet, besides the few involved with this, there are people who have passing pleasure in the mind. And they can enjoy it. The question is, what is your pleasure? There's the ordinary available pleasures of the mind only go up to a certain level. And ordinary people never find that level. They're not looking for the level. They simply pursue whatever it is. But an ordinary person, in the same way that most people, the majority of the planet, sit around, if you start doing this and they're talking to them, they're going, if they've got any sense, just ordinarily, if it is really getting bad and them fidgeting their feet, then sometime later, they're going to go home and put on their Snickers and go out for a run, or go out and dig in the garden. This kind of fidgeting is, I need a little action, physically. And so some people at times can be sitting around, staring out the window, watching TV or doing nothing, and mentally feel like they're going, dun, 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 dun. And they may go pick up, let's say, a crossword puzzle book. I'm just using that. And it's the same way that an ordinary person who is physically requiring or needing some stimulation will get out and run, or go dig in the garden, or just go out in the garage and start straightening up boxes, or re-straightening them up. They did it last month. They just rearrange them. But it's just to do something. It's so that the body doesn't keep going, get up and move. There are people who would experience that. Everyone does to a little degree, but there are people who specifically experience that, and they will do something, such as get up and work the crossword puzzle. But when I said they never see the extent of it, they never get past that point, they find the satisfaction being to the point that they're tired of doing the crossword puzzle. I knew that was too blunt. You can't accomplish anything if you only do it to the point that you're satisfied. If you're sitting around, let's say you now, if you're sitting around and you realize, well, God, I'm sick of watching TV, or playing on the net, or staring at the floor, I'll do something to give me some stimulation. And let's say that you go pick up a book on some subject, something that requires a little attention. And you read, but you only read until the point that you're tired of reading. See, that's so blunt, an ordinary mind goes, so. I know. It's not only easy to miss, it's almost impossible to get. Well, an ordinary person, let's go back to the physical one. We all know this because there is nothing funny at that range unless you're actually training for some sort of competition. But if you're just sitting around and you begin to do this, and realize, well, I need to go run and calm down, and my body's telling me, get your ass up. You go out and run, and unless you're training for some specific reason, sanely, reasonably, all you do is go run until you're tired of running. You get tired of running and you go back home, that's it. That's all people do mentally, even when they're aware, even when they experience the mental fidget and try and use the mind to try and stimulate thinking, to try and get some pleasure out of the mind, which is what they're doing. Then they operate on the same basis, unless you have some reason to suspect otherwise, and then unless you are wired up to have the potential ability to do so, to follow through on the desire to suspect and then desire it, you will, in the same way, mentally stop when you've done enough mentally. You get tired of running. You sit there and you read, or you work crossword puzzles, you do whatever it is, and just suddenly, it will always happen, it's like you've lost interest. The amount of interest a person has in what they're doing is simply an aspect of what they are mechanically, what they are genetically, and I don't care if it is so-called spiritual or mental, it will take you nowhere. And that is the extent to which the mind will operate. That is the extent to which thoughts will normally cooperate with you. The proof of that is right before everyone, if you need proof. This is really a waste of time, but since I already opened my mouth. The whole idea of people sensing that life is indescribable, and especially people who have undergone some sort of experience out of the ordinary, and it does not have to be anything that I've been referring to or quoting as that kind of mystical enlightenment. It can be people who have undergone an extraordinary, every day, but an extraordinary to them, emotional experience, such as a near brush with death, or a death of their mother or father, something that really, as they call it, was traumatizing, what they like to call it. And they can get through with it and at times believe that they have had some new insight into life. And you go, well, You know, I'm not surprised, though, the way it affected you, the way you were so shocked and in sorrow about your mother's death or whatnot, and maybe just a few weeks later, and they go, that's true. I almost had some sort of, I don't know, like spiritual insight. I've got a whole new view of life now. It just changed everything. You say, well, you know, I'd like to hear it. And they go, well, I don't know. I just can't describe it. The point being, all the way from that, which can happen to quite ordinary people, that is not an extraordinary scenario I just described, all the way from that to the so-called experiences of some real mystical awakening, which covers a wide spectrum there is this continuing observation or claim that there are certain insights into life that a person says they're sure that they have seen something. And of course, we're saying seen something. We're talking about a mental activity. We're not talking about something they physically saw. They say they have understood something that is absolutely astounding, that was without any thing comparable in their life that they'd ever thought about, heard about. And you go, well, tell me. And they go, well, I've thought about it and I can't tell you. Why is that? Now, there are all sorts of ways to look at it, but I was trying to give you a very blunt one, and that is that the mind cannot go past itself. That's not all. And the mind cannot realize it. And that's when it's left with, I don't know what to tell you. And there is something right past that the mind could tell you that it does not tell you. But it cannot tell you until it realizes that it has reached its limit, is the cause of the first statement of someone saying. And let's don't question it. Let's just take some ordinary person. They say, last night for some reason I'd been sitting up all night, or I was driving home from a business trip out of town. I was up all night and I don't know why. I passed a car wreck. Something. And they said, there it was, the middle of the night, and here I was between Nashville and Memphis, up there in the mountains, and suddenly I looked out. I never had anything like that. It was like, I don't want to overdo this, but it was, I suddenly had a feeling about life that I'd never had before. It was like, I mean, it really affected me. And you say, well, what was it? And they go, well, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to say. I've thought about it since then. I don't know what to say. But I wanted to tell somebody. All right. Now, I'm not trying to, as you know, overdo that. And what I was trying to represent was a fairly everyday, ordinary person. People have such experiences. As a rule, they don't even talk about them because they have no one to even mention it to. But it is not totally out of the everyday experience or ordinary experience for men to have someone they can talk to, like a coffee drinking buddy or just somebody that a family member, but somebody that they can say, you know, and tell them something like, I just have a flash every now and then. I think that life is not what it appears. I keep almost being able to see life in a different way. And they go, well, how so? And so I don't know what to say. I can't tell you what it is I see. And yet the experience is real. They know there's no question about the experience. If you ask them, well, are you sure you weren't hallucinating? They know damn well they weren't. Were you taking, uppers or bennies while you're driving? Oh, no, it wasn't anything like that. They know without any doubt it was real. In fact, if you actually ask them a certain way, you go, well, to them it was more real than ordinary. And yet they cannot say anything about it. And what I'm trying to tell you is that there is something else that can be said under even routine conditions. Not extraordinary people, not would-be so-called mystics, but amongst these ordinary people, if they could get past that one thing that they're stating themselves, that they're looking at dead in the eye and they can't see it, they can't say it. They say, I don't know what to tell you, I can't describe it. You understand? And yet it was something that they experienced. That they saw something internally, remember, we're talking about. They saw something, and they cannot describe it. How can that be? What can you see that you can't describe? Ordinary people, if they are hallucinating, as they call it, ordinary people down at a childish level, if they see something, they go, last night I saw a spirit, I saw a ghost. You go, are you serious? A ghost? Well, that was worse. It was like a combination of ghost and goblin, I think. Maybe a part of a troll. You go, well, can you describe it? Oh, yeah. Or they say, last night I saw God. Can you describe him? Oh, yeah. He's about a 42 long. That's an old story. I moved the stakes up. It's originally about Moses, was a 42 long. People in the garment business, but never mind. Anyway, somebody can say something extraordinary. They say, I was visited by an alien from another galaxy that we've never even heard of. I mean, a total alien. Nothing like us. Can you describe him? Oh, yeah. The mind can describe anything if it says it saw it. And you say, can you describe it? It'll say, yeah, except in one instance. Well, the instances, it seems like plurals, as I'm telling you, all the way from those who have experienced a drastic shift in consciousness, the so-called awakening and liberation, etc., to what I'm telling you is that everyday ordinary people have flashes of this, and at times even try to say, I've had some sort of unusual experience. Not externally. I didn't see a ghost. No one talked to me. I saw something here. Something just, and they don't really know how to describe it because they're not used to struggling for it. Whereas people who are struggling for it, they know exactly, if it does happen, where it happened. But an ordinary person says, I saw something, I experienced something, I understood something, or I suspected something. Suspect on the basis that they knew it was real, that the experience was real. And yet they cannot say anything about it. Why, when they can describe anything else. You understand? Anything else that a man says he saw. Forget it, either an alien, God, anything. If he says he saw it, even if he made it up, if it was imaginary, whatever the hell that means, but if it was imaginary, you say, can you describe it? Oh, yeah. And yet these experiences cannot be described. Why? And there's nothing alien about it. There's nothing supernatural about it. There's nothing godly or spooky about it. The reason they cannot describe it, it is the mind having reached its limit. That, my friends, is a low-level mystical experience. It can be, I should say. The mind constantly reaches its limit with people, which is exactly when somebody's even seeking mental stimulation. When they sit down to read a book, when they sit down and decide to read through a listing of newly discovered equations for mental recreation, they eventually get tired of it. Or they work crossword puzzles until they're tired of it. They're tired of it in a real crude sense, but nonetheless true, when the mind has reached this limit of nourishment. If you can take it just a little bit further, I just want you to understand it happens to people all the time. The mind gets full. But you can even see it in a bit more precise way that I was trying to point out to you, that if a person sits down and actually tries to think about something that requires effort, not anything related to external, not simply the basis of trying to figure out a new way to build a thermostat or some new idea of an internal combustion engine, not anything to do with the external world, but a man trying to ponder the nature of the internal world, to reflect, to actually, as men call it now, to reflect, to try and think on the nature, let's say, of the mind, the nature of the human spirit, anything. No matter his IQ, no matter his education in philosophy or psychology or whatever, the mind will get to a point that it cannot go any further, which is not that hard to get to. But it's damn near impossible for a mind here and there to realize what has happened. Now, they will say things like, well, I can't come up with the answer to this. And I don't mean to make it all, well, you know why I'm doing it. A cosmologist, someone in the hard sciences, can still turn somewhat philosophical in it in the matter of time, although time, they believe has a real scientific or physical basis. But let's say that a cosmologist, a physicist, can speculate on what is time, and he can sit around and think about it. What is time? And it's like the mind will get to a place, and to him he thinks, well, I can't get anywhere. But he doesn't think about it as being the limits of the mind. He thinks about it being the limits of my particular mental course. I have pursued a certain path, and I have reached a dead end. I mean, that's very common for a philosopher to say that in any field, if he's attempting to wax or pursue some philosophical or theoretical line all the way from theology to physics. As a man says, well, I have been trying to pursue, why is there evil in the world? What is time? How can we tell up from down? And he goes on and on and on. He says, I don't know. I have worked on this for years, and I keep getting to one place, and I can't go any further. But he never attributes it. No matter how wise and renowned he is, they never attribute it to what's happened. They never attribute the situation. They never understand the situation as it has actually occurred. Because if they did, they could go at least one step further without even being a mystic. As I said, for all intents and purposes, you might as well be a mystic if you could get that one step further. It's that you would understand why the indescribable is indescribable. You would understand why men have an experience that they have touched on something even more real and important in life than anything else that they've ever experienced. And yet here they are 2 seconds later, they don't know what the hell to say about it. And of course, then they want to say, well, I had a mystical experience, obviously, and it just probably was such a shock that I've wiped it from my memory. Or it was aspiritual, if they were more religious. I believe God or Allah, something happened. Somebody spoke to me. I had some sort of extraordinary experience, and it was so extraordinary I couldn't deal with it. It's like post-traumatic amnesia. As long as you say that, you're done for. As long as you say that, you got to weigh out the same way as a physicist saying, well, I guess my line of inquiry, my line of speculation is proving to be somewhat barren. It may ultimately prove to be fruitless, and I have to change my tact. They can change their tact all they want to, but it will still be a cul-de-sac. And they will never see why. Believe it or not, in the last few seconds, this is connected with attachments. There is only one thing useful. There is only one useful way, but only one thing. Let's go ahead and to which a man can sever attachments. And that's thought. That's the only thing. I was going to build up to it slowly, but what the hell? That's it. That's it. Some of you know it. Some of you have heard me say it many times. Hell, I've heard me say it many times. Well, you won't. Say it again. You say it for her, Sam. Say it for me. Go to hell, Sam. Play it yourself. You got your own piano. You play it for yourself, Sam. So much for black and white.